The grand halls of the Sci-Fi War Council were filled with towering warriors, their deep voices echoing through the chamber. Captain Jason Cross stood in the center, trying to keep his usual cocky grin. He had been in plenty of tough negotiations before, but this was a disaster. All he did was accept a simple toast, a friendly gesture, or so he thought. Now, every pair of glowing, inhuman eyes in the room was locked onto him. Across from him, Zyra Thalvek stood tense, her arms crossed. She was a Sci-Fi warrior, and by their law, Jason had just sworn a life debt to her. "Human," Zyra said, her voice sharp as a blade. "You do not understand what you have done." Jason shrugged. "I drank, I nodded, I smiled. You people take your parties way too seriously." An older warrior stepped forward, his thick armor gleaming under the torchlight. He looked between Jason and Zyra, his expression unreadable. "By the customs of our ancestors, you have accepted the sacred bond. You are now tied to Zyra Thalvek." Jason frowned. "Tied? What do you mean, tied?" Zyra closed her eyes for a long moment, like she was trying to summon patience. When she opened them, they burned with frustration. "It means you are my mate for life." Jason choked. "Wait, what?" Laughter erupted from some of the warriors, while others muttered among themselves. Zyra stepped closer, lowering her voice. "This is not a joke, Jason Cross. The Sci-Fi do not take oaths lightly. By drinking from the sacred cup, you have sworn your life to me." Jason opened his mouth, then closed it. His heart pounded. He wasn't against the idea of romance, but this. He had just met Zyra, and now an entire alien species expected him to stand beside her forever. "Look, Zyra," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I respect your people's traditions, but I think we can agree this is a huge misunderstanding." Zyra's jaw tightened. The Sci-Fi do not break sacred vows. Jason exhaled. "Right, that's a problem." The warlord, the massive man who was clearly Zyra's father, took a step forward. "Human, if you refuse this bond, you insult our people. There will be no peace between us." Jason looked around. The warriors all watched him carefully, their hands near their weapons. One wrong move, and he wouldn't leave this hall alive. He turned back to Zyra, who was watching him with unreadable eyes. "You want me to back out of this, don't you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated before answering. "You are not Sci-Fi. You do not belong in this world, in my life. If you leave now, it will be easier for both of us." Jason's mind raced. He could still walk away, let the diplomats sort this mess out. But then he thought about what would happen. The Sci-Fi would see humans as dishonorable. Every treaty, every deal, every bit of trust Earth had built with them, gone. Jason Cross didn't break his word, and he wasn't about to start now. Taking a deep breath, he looked Zyra in the eyes. "You're right, I don't belong here, but I made a promise, and humans always keep their word." The room went silent. Even Zyra's father looked surprised. Zyra stared at Jason, her expression unreadable. Then, very slowly, she shook her head. "You are a fool, human." Jason grinned. "Yeah, I hear that a lot." The warlord clapped a heavy hand on Jason's shoulder, nearly knocking him over. "Then it is decided. The human accepts the bond." The warriors roared in approval. Zyra sighed, running a hand over her face. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." Jason smirked. "Probably not, but hey, what's the worst that could happen?" At that moment, the warlord's grin turned dangerous. "Tomorrow, you will prove your worth in combat." Jason's stomach dropped. Zyra gave him a flat look. "Congratulations, mate. You just agreed to fight in the trial of fire." Jason Cross woke up to the sound of heavy boots stomping outside his quarters. He groaned, rubbing his face as the events of last night hit him again. Bonded for life. Combat trial. What had he gotten himself into? The door slid open, and Zyra Thalvek strode inside. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. "You are late," she said. Jason glanced at the small window, where twin suns were just beginning to rise. "It's barely morning," he muttered. "Can't we ease into this whole prove your worth thing?" Zyra crossed her arms. "The trial of fire begins at dawn. You will be tested before the War Council, and if you fail. Jason sighed. Let me guess. The Xi will think I'm weak, and I'll bring dishonor to your name, and your father will have me thrown into a black hole. Zura's lips twitched, almost like she wanted to smile. Almost. Something like that. Jason sat up. And what exactly does this trial involve? Zura hesitated. It is a battle against an opponent chosen by the council. Jason stared at her. A battle? Like a friendly sparring match or? She didn't answer. That was not a good sign. Jason swung his legs over the bed. Zura, just tell me, what kind of fight are we talking about? Zura exhaled. You will face an Xi warrior in single combat. The fight ends when one of you yields or is unable to continue. Jason blinked. Oh, great. Minutes later, Jason stood in the center of a massive arena. The crowd roared around him. Hundreds of Xi warriors gathered to witness the spectacle. Massive banners swayed in the wind, and above them, the warlord himself watched from a stone balcony, his arms crossed. Jason rolled his shoulders, trying to look confident. Zura stood beside him, speaking quietly. You can still refuse, she said. There is no shame in stepping down. Jason smirked. And what happens if I do? She glanced at the crowd. They will see you as a coward. My father will likely reject our bond. You will be sent back to your people in disgrace. Jason whistled. Yeah, not a fan of that option. A massive gate rumbled open on the other side of the arena. Out stepped a mountain of muscle. Jason's opponent. The warrior's armor gleamed under the sunlight, and in his hands he held a long shock spear that crackled with blue energy. Jason sighed. Of course, it's a giant. The warrior pounded his chest and bellowed. I am Valkor, son of the Iron Fang. I will test this human's worth. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jason, on the other hand, took a slow step back. Zura put a hand on his shoulder. Stay calm. Do not try to overpower him. You will lose. Use your speed, your intelligence. Outthink him. Jason gave her a sideways glance. Any chance you've got a secret plan to help me win? Zura hesitated. No, but she looked into his eyes, something unspoken passing between them. I do not wish to see you fall. Jason blinked. That was the closest thing to concern she had ever shown him. He grinned. Well, now I have to win. The warlord raised his arm. Begin. Valkor charged like a freight train, his spear aimed straight at Jason's chest. Jason ducked, barely avoiding the crackling weapon as it sliced through the air. Okay, new plan. Don't get hit, Jason muttered, rolling out of the way. The crowd roared. Zura watched with narrowed eyes, her hands clenched into fists. Jason had survived plenty of fights before, but this was just the beginning. Jason barely dodged as Valkor's shock spear slammed into the ground, sending out a surge of crackling energy. The force rippled through the arena, making the stone floor tremble beneath his feet. Stars above, Jason muttered, rolling to the side as the warrior swung again. You people don't believe in warm-ups, do you? Valkor bared his teeth in what could have been either a grin or a snarl. Fight, human, or be broken. Jason exhaled, his muscles tensed. He couldn't overpower this guy. Zura had said as much, and she was right, but brute strength wasn't the only way to win a fight. He needed to think. As Valkor lunged forward again, Jason didn't retreat. Instead, he ran toward the giant warrior, ducking under the spear and sliding between his legs at the last second. The crowd gasped as Jason popped up behind Valkor and delivered a solid kick to the back of his knee. The massive warrior stumbled, just for a moment. Jason smirked. Well, look at that. You can move. Valkor growled and whirled around, swinging the spear horizontally. Jason barely ducked in time. The weapon whooshed over his head, kicking up a gust of wind. Fast, Valkor admitted, but speed will not save you forever. Jason had no intention of running forever. He just needed an opening. As the massive warrior advanced again, Jason watched carefully, not just Valkor's weapon, but the way he moved, the shift in his balance, the way his shoulders tensed before each attack. There, the spear shot forward. This time, Jason didn't dodge. Instead, he sidestepped at the last second and grabbed the shaft of the weapon with both hands. Using Valkor's own momentum, he yanked it forward, sending the warrior stumbling past him. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Jason twirled the spear in his hands, testing its weight. "You know," he said, "humans have a saying. The bigger they are, the harder they fall." Valkor turned, eyes blazing. "I will not fall." "Guess we'll see." Jason threw the spear, not at Valkor, but at his feet. The weapon's crackling energy discharged on impact, sending up a burst of blinding light and static. Valkor roared, staggering backward, momentarily disoriented. Jason didn't waste a second. He dashed forward, leaped onto Valkor's chest, and slammed his fist into the warrior's helmet. Once, twice, a third time. With a final thunderous impact, Valkor fell backward, crashing to the ground with enough force to shake the arena. Silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, Valkor groaned and raised a hand in surrender. "I yield." The arena erupted into stunned applause and shouts of disbelief. Jason rolled off Valkor, gasping for breath. "Never thought I'd win a fight by climbing a guy like a tree," he muttered. He looked up and found Zyra staring at him, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said softly. Jason grinned, still breathless. "You sound surprised." Zyra stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "No human has ever passed the trial of fire." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, well, humans keep their word." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, in a move that caught him completely off guard, Zyra extended her hand to him. Jason hesitated, then took it. Her grip was strong, steady. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had earned her respect. And judging by the way the warlord watched from the balcony above, the real battle was just beginning. Jason's chest still burned from exertion, but he stood tall. The arena still hummed with energy, warriors muttering in disbelief, elders whispering among themselves. He had done the impossible, defeated Valkor, one of Zyra's people's strongest warriors. At the far end of the Colosseum, the warlord, Zyra's father, rose from his massive stone throne. His deep, rumbling voice echoed across the arena. "The human has won the trial of fire." His tone was unreadable, but the weight of his words settled over everyone. And yet, a single victory does not make one worthy. Jason exhaled, glancing at Zyra. She was watching her father with a mixture of tension and defiance. He had no idea what she was thinking, but he knew one thing. He wasn't backing down now. The warlord's sharp gaze fell on Jason. "You fight well, human, but strength alone is not enough. You claimed you would not break your word. Will you prove it?" Jason wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yeah," he said, breathless but steady. "I will." A murmur ran through the crowd. Zyra's father studied him for a long moment, then gestured to Zyra. She hesitated, then stepped forward. "The trial is past," the warlord declared. "Now it is her choice." Jason frowned. Her choice. Zyra's golden eyes locked onto his. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was firm. "You won the right to stand beside me," she said. "But do you even understand what that means?" Jason let out a short laugh. "Considering nobody bothered explaining the rules before I got thrown into a death match? No, not really." She sighed, glancing toward the sky before looking back at him. "If I accept you, then you are bound to me, to my people. You are no longer just a human. You are part of something greater, and if you betray that, they will come for you." Jason's smirk faded. This was bigger than just winning a fight, bigger than proving himself. This wasn't just a game to Zyra's people. It was a sacred bond. Zyra's voice softened slightly. "You do not have to do this." Jason looked at her for a long moment. The wind stirred between them, the distant murmur of the crowd fading into the background. This wasn't just about pride anymore. He thought about Earth, about the life he had left behind, about the people who had laughed at him when he said he wanted to make a difference. He had promised Zyra he wouldn't back down, and humans keep their word. Jason squared his shoulders. I'm not walking away. Something flickered in Zira's eyes, something he couldn't quite read. Then, without another word, she turned to face the warlord. I accept him, she said. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Jason didn't miss the way some of the warriors looked downright furious. The warlord narrowed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. So be it. A thunderous horn echoed across the Colosseum. The warriors slammed their fists against their chests in unison. Zira turned to Jason, stepping closer. You will be tested again, she murmured. They will not accept you so easily. Jason smirked. Wouldn't be fun otherwise. Zira huffed in amusement, shaking her head. Then, to his surprise, she reached for his wrist and pressed her palm against his. The moment their hands touched, a pulse of warmth ran through him. Jason's breath caught. It wasn't just a simple gesture. There was something ancient about it. Something binding. The deal was sealed, and Jason had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. Jason barely had time to process what had happened before Zira's grip tightened around his wrist. The warmth from their brief contact still lingered, but her expression had already hardened. You don't understand what you just agreed to, she muttered under her breath. Jason arched a brow, smirking. I'm starting to get that feeling. Before Zira could respond, the warlord raised his hand, silencing the murmuring crowd. His piercing gaze swept over the warriors around them before settling on Jason. The bond has been acknowledged, the warlord declared. But a mere word is not enough. A warrior proves their worth through action, and a bond is only as strong as the trials it endures. Jason exhaled sharply. More trials? Seriously? Zira shot him a sharp look. Did you think earning my father's approval would be that easy? Jason rubbed the back of his neck. Honestly, I was hoping for a little celebration first. She sighed, but didn't argue. The warlord gestured toward one of the armored warriors standing near the edge of the Colosseum. The warrior stepped forward, holding a ceremonial blade with a gleaming obsidian edge. Jason didn't like the look of that. The rite of devotion must be completed, the warlord continued. If he is truly bound to you, he will not hesitate. Jason narrowed his eyes. What exactly does that mean? Zira hesitated, just for a second. Then she turned to him, voice lower, more urgent. It's a test of trust. You must offer your hand and accept a mark. Jason glanced between her and the blade. And by mark, you mean? Zira exhaled. A cut. Jason blinked. You people really love stabbing things, huh? Zira didn't smile. That was concerning. He looked at the warlord, then at the silent crowd. Every single warrior was watching him, waiting, judging. Jason had a choice. He could refuse, walk away, pretend none of this ever happened, go back to his old life. Or he could take the blade, prove his word meant something. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to meet Zira's gaze. She wasn't asking him to do this. If anything, she looked concerned, which meant it was his decision. Jason stepped forward and held out his hand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The warrior holding the blade barely hesitated before placing the hilt into Jason's grip. The weight of it was heavier than he expected, cold and solid, like the gravity of the moment itself. The warlord nodded. If you falter, if you hesitate, this bond means nothing. Jason clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to hesitate. With one swift motion, he dragged the blade across his palm. A sharp sting shot through his skin, followed by warmth. The blood welled up immediately, bright against the dark blade. The warriors stomped their feet once, a deep, resonating sound of approval. Jason let out a slow breath, clenching his fingers into a fist as the blood dripped onto the stone floor. Zira stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to do that. Jason smirked, ignoring the throbbing in his hand. Told you, I don't break my word. For a moment, something flickered in her golden eyes. Then, to his surprise, she lifted his injured hand and pressed her palm against his. The moment their skin touched, a strange energy pulsed through him, warm and electric, like an unspoken promise. The warlord watched in silence. Then he gave a single nod. "The bond is sealed," he declared. Jason had passed the test, but somehow he had a feeling the real challenges were only just beginning. Jason flexed his fingers, watching as Zyra carefully wrapped his wounded hand in a bandage. The cut wasn't deep, but it stung, a sharp reminder of the promise he had just made. Around them, the warriors dispersed, though not without murmurs of approval or skepticism. Zyra tied the bandage firmly. "You didn't have to do that." Jason smirked. "I think we've established that I don't do things halfway." She studied him for a moment, her golden eyes unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and motioned for him to follow. As they walked through the stone corridors of the war camp, Jason took in the alien architecture. Towering pillars, glowing symbols carved into the walls, and strange banners fluttering in an unseen breeze. He still wasn't sure what half of it meant, but one thing was clear: this was a world built on strength and honor. "You should rest," Zyra said as they reached a large chamber. It was her private quarters, simple but well kept, with weapons mounted on the walls and a bed large enough to fit a warrior. Jason leaned against the doorway. "You're worried about me." Zyra crossed her arms. "I need you at full strength." Jason grinned. "That's not a no." She sighed, turning away. "You're impossible." Jason sat down on the edge of the bed, watching her. There was something different about her now, less rigid, more thoughtful. She had spent her whole life in a society where emotions were secondary to duty, but now, for the first time, someone had put her above tradition. "I meant what I said, you know," Jason said after a moment. Zyra turned back to him. "What?" "That I don't break my word." He flexed his bandaged hand. "This isn't just about proving something to your father or your people. It's about you." For the first time since he met her, Zyra looked uncertain. She sat down beside him, not quite touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. The silence between them was thick with unsaid words. Jason finally broke it. "What happens now?" Zyra hesitated before answering. "Now, you are part of my clan. That means you must be prepared to fight alongside us, and to defend the bond you sealed today." Jason arched a brow. "Defend it from who?" Zyra's expression darkened. "There are those who will challenge it. My father may have acknowledged you, but there are warriors who do not believe a human is worthy." Jason let out a low whistle. "So I just painted a target on my back." Zyra met his gaze. "I will stand with you." The weight of those words wasn't lost on him. For someone like Zyra, loyalty wasn't given lightly. Jason smiled, then let them come. A flicker of amusement crossed her face, but it quickly faded. "You shouldn't underestimate them." Jason shrugged. "You underestimate me." She shook her head, exasperated. "You truly are reckless." Jason smirked. "And yet, you haven't thrown me out of your room." Zyra sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she reached up, her fingers grazing the edge of his bandage. The touch was brief, but it sent a strange warmth through him. "Rest," she said, standing. "Tomorrow, we prepare." Jason lay back, watching as she walked toward the door. Whatever came next, he wasn't going to back down. Jason stood in the center of the training grounds, rolling his shoulders as the gathered warriors surrounded him in a loose circle. Some watched in silence, while others muttered among themselves, their disbelief clear on their faces. A human standing beside their future leader. They didn't buy it. Zyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "They will test you," she warned. Jason smirked. "Good. I was getting bored." The air grew heavy as a towering alien warrior stepped forward. His dark armor gleamed under the twin suns, and his deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I am Valak," the warrior announced. "You claim to stand as one of us. Prove it." Jason exhaled slowly, sizing up his opponent. Valak was bigger, stronger, and had probably trained since birth to crush enemies. Jason had sarcasm and a stubborn streak. "All right," Jason said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's dance." Valak wasted no time. He lunged, swinging the heavy fist toward Jason's head. Jason barely ducked in time, feeling the wind from the strike brush past his hair. The crowd roared with approval. Jason grinned. "Oh, you hit hard. That's cute." Valak's eyes narrowed. This time, he feinted left before twisting with a kick. Jason barely dodged, rolling to the side as the ground cracked from the impact. Zira crossed her arms, watching carefully. She had seen Jason fight before, but this was different. This wasn't just about skill, it was about proving he belonged. Jason knew he couldn't match Valak in strength, so he did what humans did best. He adapted. Instead of blocking the next strike, Jason sidestepped at the last second, using Valak's momentum against him. The massive warrior stumbled forward, just for a second. That was all Jason needed. He ducked low and swept Valak's legs out from under him. The warrior hit the ground hard. A stunned silence filled the air. Jason grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You good, big guy?" Valak blinked up at him before breaking into deep laughter. He stood, brushing the dust from his armor. Then, to Jason's surprise, he clapped a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You fight with honor," Valak said, "and with cunning. Perhaps there is hope for you yet." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Jason turned to Zyra. "See, told you I'd survive." She shook her head, but there was a glint of amusement in her golden eyes. This was only the beginning. Jason exhaled. Of course it was. The crowd began to disperse, but before Jason could relax, Zyra stepped closer. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quieter, "the real challenge begins." Jason frowned. That wasn't the real challenge. Zyra studied him for a moment before answering. "No, that was just to see if you deserve the chance." A chill ran down Jason's spine. Zyra's voice softened. "I will stand with you, no matter what comes next." Jason met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. He wasn't sure what was coming, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't face it alone. The next morning, Jason stood at the edge of the sacred arena, watching as Zyra's people gathered. There were hundreds of them, warriors, elders, and nobles alike. Today was the final test, the one that would determine whether he truly had a place among them. Zyra stood beside him, her voice low. "The trial of honor is different from yesterday's test. You won the respect of a warrior, but today you must win the respect of the entire clan." Jason smirked, though he could feel the tension in his chest. "And how do I do that?" "Another fight." Zyra hesitated before answering. "Not exactly." A deep drum sounded, and the crowd parted as the High Elder stepped forward. He was old, his long silver hair braided with gold rings, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. "The human stands before us," the Elder announced. "He has shown strength, but now he must show his heart." Jason raised an eyebrow. "I'm all heart, old man." The Elder ignored him. "A warrior is nothing without honor, and honor is tested not in battle, but in sacrifice." Jason's smirk faded. That didn't sound good. The Elder gestured, and two guards stepped forward, carrying something between them. A ceremonial blade, long and curved, gleamed in the sunlight. Jason glanced at Zyra. "Should I be worried?" Zyra met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "This blade is not meant to take life. It is meant to seal a vow." Jason's heart pounded as the Elder continued. "If the human wishes to stand among us, he must swear an oath in blood, an unbreakable promise." Jason swallowed. What kind of promise? The Elder's voice echoed through the arena. "To protect Zyra, to stand by her side, in war and in peace, to fight for her people as if they were his own, to never betray the bond they now share." Jason felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. This was it, the moment everything came down to. Zyra stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this." Jason looked at her, and in that moment he knew. He had faced death, fought impossible odds, and somehow come out the other side. But this wasn't about proving himself anymore. This was about her. Jason reached for the blade, gripping the hilt tightly. Then, without hesitation, he dragged the edge across his palm. Blood welled up, dark against his skin. "I swear it," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, no matter where this path leads, I will stand by Zyra, always." A hush fell over the crowd. Then, slowly, the Elder nodded. "It is done." Zyra let out a quiet breath. Jason turned to her, and for the first time since he had arrived in her world, he saw something unguarded in her eyes. Relief, gratitude, something deeper. She stepped forward and took his wounded hand in hers. "You are impossible," she murmured. Jason grinned. "And yet, you're stuck with me." The crowd erupted into cheers. Warriors pounded their chests. Elders bowed their heads, and for the first time, Jason wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was one of them.